So, um, well, I think for me it's clearly a challenge to understand as well all of the compliance issues. And I think looking at results in the poll, um, yeah, I think if just 1 out of 5 say that they have this in place, a clear process, and then the other question was 1 out of 3 basically understands the uh, 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 compliance issues. I think it is clear that there's some room for improvement, and of course, I'm 100% sure. And Andrea, who will join us in a second as well, can relate to this probably. Um, the people that are currently in our audience attending this might not be the people that need to actively do all of this. Probably there need to be different people helping on this. Do you have a clear view on what divisions take this in account or have to create countermeasures, proposals? How do you see this?
I'll jump in. So
Yeah.
clearly, it takes a village, right? And it really depends on what aspect of the issue you're looking at. If you're looking at what kind of policy and disclosures do we do, that clearly sits with legal, right?
Hmm.
But the operational part, if you are, if you're a rental operator and you realize that you need to clear information after every rental, that sits in operations, right? That's the decision of who manages the actual fleet.
Yeah.
In fact, most of our counterparts in the United States are the remarketing people. It is actually this crowd on the phone because they are the stakeholders, right? The vehicle is transacting under their oversight. It contains data, as Odia pointed out, right? Is it fair and lawful to leave somebody's home address and phone data behind? What's the legal reason, right? What's the important business reason to retain this data? There's none, right? It's really hard to advocate it, right? And so, who is the person that should be creating a program to manage the deletion of the data? That's probably these remarketing people that are on the line today.
Hmm. Okay. We have a question there from who is defined as the data controller, and I think it's a bit related to what we just discussed. But if we take a very typical remarketing journey, almost, you have got a driver of a vehicle who uses this car for the company, but is basically owned by a lease company who then afterwards does the remarketing maybe through an auction company, and then afterwards it's got a dealer who will sell it to the end consumer. Now, is every party liable in this complete journey, or is it every step, or is it just one step, or
It's like, the game Twister, where like you
mm,
have people and there's like, hands and feet, and people like twist over themselves and they try to be there all together. That's what's happening. It's not even what you said, which is one after the other. And yes, all of them are, but it's also together, right? So it's not just the rental company, it's the rental company, it's the infotainment company, it's the operating system company that has the operating system in the car, it's the third party provider that provides emergency assistance, it's the there, it's a lot, right? And they are twisted, and they each don't, they not, they all, especially now, right? They don't all necessarily have the same purposes. They don't necessarily even, show each other like, not everybody is privy to the same information. The car facilitates the collection of the information, but once, like, let's say, I don't know, whatever the operating system is, there are a number of different options now, right? They get the information, the OEM doesn't get the information anymore. They facilitate it, but they don't see it. So yes, there are, and this is actually in the EDPB guidelines, they're saying there are a lot of stakeholders. They are also consecutive, but they also overlap. There is a lot of transfer of information going on. There is liability basically for everybody that touches the data, but like in different different stages, right? Like if you are a data controller, you have all of the information, all of the liability. Query whether some of these parties are, this is a GDPR concept, joint controllers, because they are at least jointly, they have a joint purpose. Sometimes they are independent, but also there are service providers, right? That are data processors that process information on behalf of some of these. And they also have liability, not full liability, but they have responsibilities. So that also ties into the complexity of the situation, because not only because, sorry, right, but you need data processing agreements between all of these chains, right? But also because for the purpose of access and deletion, you need to also, again, know what everybody's doing so that you can either facilitate it, or at least if you don't have control over it, which there are situations where you really don't have control over it, because it's an independent other party, at least kind of, so the individual needs to know, okay, this is the universe of, this is what needs to happen in order for my stuff to need to get at it or delete it.
I'll add something to this if you don't mind, Johan. So,
No, sure.
So the way I think about it is that there's really two types of data collection that matters. One is the data that is collected and stored locally on the car. And then with connected vehicles, this data goes out, right? So of the portfolio of cars that go through remarketing, still today a lot belongs to the first bucket, not to the second. The second is a lot more complex, as Odia just mentioned, right? But so those are two different problems. The other thing that I think is important to point out is that when you have financial ownership of the vehicle, you are the first line of defense because you are the true controller, right? You have ownership of the vehicle, you have control of the asset. But as you pointed out, there's other parties involved, like auctions, for instance, right? And in fact, what we're starting to see on both sides of the ocean is that auctions are starting to give legal documents to their customers saying, hey, we have realized that vehicles that we're remarketing contain personal information. Now, you can either choose to remove the data, or if you decide that this is something your company does not want to do, we ask you to hold us, the auction, harmless in case of legal proceedings. Mm-hmm. And so, those processors, that, as Odia said, they're not the first line of defense, but they have some sort of core responsibility into it. They're starting to put their hands out and say, hold on a second, we don't want to be, it's not our car, it's not our decision, we don't own it. We cannot make independently this assessment or decision or processing of the vehicle of the information, including deleting it. But we want to have some safeguards in place, or we'll help you get rid of the problem.
Now, how feasible is it to basically delete personal data when people get a vehicle for just a day or two? And then, of course, I'm talking about short-term rental. Are there examples of good data privacy handling that you've
yes.
seen? Or
There's plenty. I mean, in the United States, we work with over 400 auctions, and we work with, anything from manufacturers to banks to almost all fleet management companies. So, is it possible? Yes. How hard is it? It's not very hard if you know what you're doing. I mean, mm-hmm. Our average time to process a vehicle is 1.5 minutes or less. So it is not burdensome. It probably takes longer to vacuum the floors of the car than actually removing the data, right? So the other thing that I want to point out is that we've done a survey in California, because California is probably the closest state to Europe, I guess, right, in terms of regulation. But of these 600 consumers that we polled, 9 out of 10 told us that they would change their purchasing behavior and will be willing to pay for a number of services to protect their privacy. And I think that's something that businesses need to be thinking about too, right? So I often have conversation with companies and they start with the approach of, oh, this is a headache from a legal standpoint. And I always try to tell them, if you are fast to act, this actually becomes an opportunity. Why not telling consumers you go the extra miles and protect them? And why they should choose you instead of somebody else? and why you don't create services around it. In fact, we start to see a number of companies doing that.
And I would say it's a headache the other way too. It's not doing anything is a headache as well, or at least it's becoming a headache. Okay. So in Europe, I think it is legally already a headache, but enforcement has not caught up with it. So when, if you have a headache in the woods and nobody enforces, is it really a headache? Right. So Europe is there. In the US, we have the laws are moving, and especially now. So in California, you have a privacy law right now, but it is being upgraded to another privacy law. It's called the California Privacy Rights Act, CPRA. That is going into effect in January. That takes what the existing law had, which is some consumer rights, et cetera, but making this, like, beefing it up and getting it closer to GDPR. So there is a specific mention on disclosure in the car. There are new regulations that talk about disclosures and the difficulty of disclosures as between the different stakeholders. They're not specifically saying, well, they actually do. They have a car example in the regs with respect to rental companies. I'll post it afterwards, or you guys can connect me and I'll post it afterwards. There is literally an example in the new regs with respect to disclosures by rental companies. So there's a focus on the disclosure. And then there is also this European concept of the burden is on the company to figure out whether it is even allowed to do this or not. This is a new thing in US law. We are going to see it in 2023 in the California law, as well as Virginia, Colorado. It's also in the draft federal bill that was filed last week. So this kind of duty of saying, hey, are we even supposed to collect this? And if we are we supposed to keep it? Like, we can't keep it for longer than necessary for the purpose for which it was collected. This whole analysis is something that companies are required to make. And I think that is good. And there's a retention limitation, same as GDPR, can't retain it for longer than necessary for the purpose. Well, new owner, no more purpose, right? So now I think, whereas in Europe, you have a headache that has not yet been enforced. In the US, you have an upcoming headache in January. So, maybe you can, this is the time to get whatever European cool version of Adwell we can get in order to prevent it.
But if I can raise maybe a bit, maybe, I don't know, maybe 10%, 20% of the audience now is a bit skeptical and says, yeah, but of course we know if you talk about lawsuits, this is in America, this is normal and everything. But how is enforcement? Where do you see enforcement gonna come here in Europe? Do you see the first signs? Are there some examples, or what is your expectation on this?
Well, all it takes is one consumer to complain, right? That's all it takes, right? And so I think that, if you're in the audience, you should ask yourself, how large is my portfolio? How many cars do I go through? And so how many times do I roll the dice on something that start to getting headlines more and more increasingly, on people asking, what about data collection in cars and what protections need to be there? And how many times do you need to roll something which nothing happens? And as time passes, that awareness raises, I think that risk goes up. And there are a number of, past examples in Europe specifically, right? And not to mention, of course, in the United States, for all rental car companies have already been sued, right? 2 of them already settled. Mm-hmm. But in Europe specifically, right, there's been cases in which a company was using a fleet and they were tracking people outside of work hours. Right? The regulators said that's not okay, right? So preserving those records was not okay. So the topic of car is coming up more and more frequently. Again, the EDPB issued guidelines specifically for vehicles. So there is no doubt that the regulators are looking at this.
And I would add something else. It's not even that it's enough that you have one consumer complain. It's enough because consumer complaining is okay, like something went wrong and the consumer is complaining. It's enough that you have one competitor complain. And that we have seen in a lot of cases where competitors file. There was one case now unrelated, but in Belgium with respect to a hospital where the hospital had to do an RFP, a tender, to engage a provider. And specifically, this is another EU problem, which is cross-border transfers of data. But the winner of the tender engaged a US company. And the loser, the second place, filed a complaint with the Belgian Data Protection Authority for a GDPR violation by the winner. And this situation of like, because you in Europe, in order to file a complaint, you can you don't have to have like be affected by it because it's a fundamental right? So people are affected by it. So the construct of not even a disgruntled consumer, but a disgruntled competitor wanting to improve their position, that's also a likelihood.
What we see, it's related to another question in the chat, whether a dealer or auction company can also has to put this in place. If we go back to the example that a driver, a company, a lease company, and afterwards, so if the first 2, 3 don't have a process in place, so a dealer has bought a vehicle which still has personal data in, despite the fact that the other parties before haven't cleaned, they could also be held liable for that?
I think so. First of all, I think that we're talking specifically here about like the deletion of the data in the car. Like dealers have their own data that they're collecting and they're using for purposes. And that's why I tried to sort of simplify it and say, whenever you have personal data, GDPR applies and everything applies. So first of all, the general answer is, can dealerships and auction companies be liable for the not disclosing, not giving access, not properly deleting personal data connected to consumers? Yes. Now, which is the data? One, they have their own data. They have CRM, they have marketing, they have lead generation, they have all that stuff. So that is its own set. What is the dealer's liability in connection with the vehicle? That is more complicated because, and that's not enforced, but that's the situation of theoretically, could they be part of, it's like that statement, right? If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? Okay. So the problem started and then the problem keeps snowballing down the hill. And it's like with, airline accidents where there is statistics apparently that like a fatal crash is 7 mistakes. That's the statistics. So, and who could be liable? Like this part and this person and this, like, could they be liable? I think they could. I mean, this kind of situation of, the liability between the different controllers is something that hasn't been tested in this context, but I think, for example, I can tell you what's happening in the US, for example. In the US right now, the standard in the California law for when you transfer information from one party to another party, even though they're not your service provider, they're just another party, you could be liable for them messing up if you didn't investigate and audit and figure and check and things like that. So I think that, I think it's a good idea for, and Andrea was talking about Village or whatever, for there to be a solution. But I think that, if you know that there's a problem and you know that you could affect it, it's probably a better idea to do something about it than not to.
Yeah.
And Johan, we just entered agreement with the first dealership group in Europe just the other day, and they sell luxury vehicles. They are very concerned, right? You don't want to sell a used vehicle to somebody and they, it's a, 50 to 150,000 euros car and you get to see where the old owner is. I mean, that's a massive headache waiting to happen, right? So that's why they were, I think first in line. And we see that typically with luxury vehicles, starting with dealerships. For fleet and fleet management, we typically start to see that, and banks, we start to see that way early, right? So I think that those will be the first companies that typically will take action, simply because they understand privacy more than most companies in the automotive space, I think. They understand the language of personal information. They understand there's probably a larger liability because they're larger entities, right? But also, for this, I can tell you all the fleet management companies in the United States, they figured out ways to generate revenue out of this. And so, if you can do the right thing and do well
Yeah.
at the same time, why shouldn't you?
So it could almost be because, of course, in Europe, just like in US, we have a lot of those as used car certified labels from OEMs or independent. So in there, it could also be an opportunity that you have this as apart from warranty, whatever have you, that this becomes part of the offer almost. That there is a process to check on personal data. So it could indeed become an opportunity. Just one thing I've also made a notice as a service history. Um, uh, if you're able to provide service history to a new potential owner, of course, if they buy a used vehicle, it's an enormous asset. And there are even lease companies, for example, that where you can see the full service history on a used car all the time. So every used car that is being offered, you can go into this and you can see it completely. So not even at the dealer, but you can see it on your computer. Is this a step too far, or would it still be okay to call it like this?
I mean, so this is this finished decision that I read briefly this morning, and I will dig in and I will post it. Those of you that are interested, but I think so. The first of all, the decision. I think whether the information in there, as with respect to the previous owner, if you don't know who the previous owner is and you just know what the vehicle is, right? Like when you're getting service history, you're not privy to, like, I'm assuming, right? You're not privy to very specific information that
Yeah.
identifies the previous owner anymore, right? Like hopefully, I don't know, it could theoretically, right? We were talking about geolocation data and like things, whatever. But like, if all you have is where was this vehicle serviced, then okay, I guess the person is living in the general vicinity of where the vehicle serviced. But like, I just had my car serviced and I went 30 miles the other way because the dealership we usually use like wasn't available and they didn't have an appointment. So like, this is what, like a radius of like, 40-mile radius. There's a lot of people here, right? So if you don't identify the previous person and it's just with respect to the vehicle, then at that point, maybe it ceases being personal data. And therefore, is there value to it? Yes. Right. And then the question, so I think that's one kind of way to look at it. The decision in Finland was looking at it some way, in another way. They're like, you as the new owner, now that you have can you ask for the previous service information as an access request? They didn't say you can't ask for it as part of, car things that are required by car laws in Europe, or, normal consumer relationship with the dealership, which arguably, or the rental company or whatever, which arguably is a good value add. They were just asking, hey, is this personal data of the owner, of the new owner? And they had very specific reasoning as to why it isn't, which I need to dig into and see if that works or not, because the EDPB's statement was, if the service history affects is connected to the billing, then it is the new owner's personal information. So I think it's two questions. Like, is it the new owner's personal information and they can get it as such? I think maybe. But is it when you get a chunk of this data that is not tied to the previous owner? And I would argue that it shouldn't be really tied to the previous owner, right? Because now it's about the vehicle specifically, and now it's about my vehicle. Then it's a different, I don't know that GDPR would necessarily apply to that.
Okay, Andrea, maybe just a final one for you, just as a very down to earth step on what then to do after all of this. I think it was a very interesting session. I think there's a lot at stake almost for X amount of players. Going back to the results of the questionnaire of the poll, I think there is a challenge still there. Where to start in an easy way?
Yeah, I would say, one, be aware that this is a challenge. Hopefully,
Yeah.
everybody realizes this today, but also be aware this is an opportunity. And it's an opportunity to be a better company, to communicate your value to your customers. It's a better way to operate and reduce risk for your company, right? So, again, don't get worried by the fact that now you realize, oh my gosh, I have a huge problem. How do I start tomorrow morning? Reality, as I said, there's a lot of it requires a village, but there's a lot of players already doing things and setting up things. Um, uh, in Europe, we're starting now to see a number of auctions that want to offer the service of deleting data. They realize it's something that their customers will need, and they realize it's something that they should be providing, because otherwise, if you don't, concerners will take the car somewhere else where they can get it done, or they will start to engage a third party to do it, or they change the way in which they market vehicles, right? So for them, it's
Yeah.
both a defensive move and a way to service their customers better. Similarly, if you are, a dealership, right, there are ways in which you can communicate that. I love your idea on, certificates. That's exactly what we start to see with dealerships. They want to produce certificates. We help them with that to communicate to consumers. We have gone the extra steps. This is why you should do business with us and not with the people across the street that sell the same car, right? And so this
Yeah.
way you don't compete only on price, but you compete on service, which is ultimately what makes the big difference between successful businesses and unsuccessful businesses. My information, I think, is available. I think we'll make the slides available. There's a bunch of
Yep.
links to other pieces of information, but we provide advice. We do to companies and help them understand what other companies are doing in the space. So feel free to reach out. Just go to Privacy for Cars and let us know how we can help.
Thanks a lot, Andrea, and thanks a lot, Odia and Andrea, to share all of this. Certainly for me, and I think also the audience, it was a very interesting topic. There might be a challenge, but I also keep in mind and want to focus on the fact that it also can be turned into an opportunity. So, people, the audience, you can easily connect to or Odia or Andrea. I'm sure that you can all find them on the appropriate social channel. So thanks a lot again, and have a good day.